This is Dave, and I'm have the privilege of being on the road again and forcing Lewis to drive the show today. I'm sitting here in Desert Springs, California, enjoying the American Bar Association Forum on Construction Law. So it's an interesting experience being in a room surrounded almost entirely by attorneys. So learning a lot from them, their point of view, their perspective. And it might be something that you want to even take a look at yourself. So it's their Forum on Construction Law. And there you can sign up to participate and see what they're thinking, and it might be worth a look. So, Lewis, thanks for making sure that you're able to drive today.
You're welcome. And I'm coming to you from reasonably sunny Nashville, Tennessee, or actually Hermitage, a suburb. And David and I were rather surprised to have as much interest in this program as we got. We had about 8 people, once the subject was announced, wrote emails with comments and questions, and so maybe we've actually hit something that people will be interested in, and we've got a pretty good attendance today, so we appreciate everyone's spending time with us, and we hope that this will be somewhat useful.
So Lewis, I see we already have our first comment. Do you realize this? Sheldon Wolf tells us he has that book. And you know what? I bet he bought the first printing.
Probably. Actually, I don't think Sheldon's quite as old as I am, but he's getting there. I was only 8 years old when this was published in 1954. You guys can do your math yourself. This is an interesting book. It's just full of multiple checklists. I just flipped it open to here's masonry work, general work included, modular system, materials, anchors, brick, concrete, masonry units, flue liners, and so forth, samples, setting drawings, mortars, general requirements. And then, in addition, in a different part, it has tips for job captains. There's a phrase that you don't hear much anymore. And then it has a whole section on equipment checklists for different types of projects, such as barber and beauty shops and churches, hospitals, laundries, and one, there's he has a project type in here that I have never worked on: bowling alleys. Have you ever done a bowling alley, David?
We have, actually. We worked on a bowling alley for what was at that time the Showboat Casino in Atlantic City.
Oh, interesting. Well, the point of Mr. Small's book, who is, of course, a leading patriarch of the CSI and made many wonderful and innovative contributions to the Institute and its programs. This book is it's a set of reminders. It doesn't really have content. So when it just says, and in that section on masonry that I was reading to you, it doesn't go into detail about the different types of mortar. It just says, remember to specify mortar. And so a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today with respect to checklists are not so much that they contain actual content, but that they are reminders. They are things that are meant to raise our consciousness level, to raise issues to our consciousness level that we probably know how to solve if we remember to do them.
Or if we remember to think about them, which is, for those of us, Lewis, you and I are getting, it's harder and harder to remember things, right? So the checklists are really a big benefit to be able to make sure that we're doing what we know we should be doing.
So we see that there are kind of three basic reasons for checklists. Why do we need them? Quality management. One of the things that checklists can do is help with consistent performance so that our outcomes are dependable. But they can also help with the staff development in terms of training, because as we're going to see as we go through this, some of the ways that you can use checklists are very proactive and people can learn by doing. Another good reason is decision management, so that decisions are made at the right time without putting them off. And it's also a way of expressing shared values within a firm or between the firm and its clients. And finally, risk management, to try to reduce liability exposure and issues with failures. Now,
right.
We had a couple of. Go ahead, David.
Oh, I was just going to say on the risk management, I think that's one of the very important issues, as well as quality management. And those two go together, because if you can identify those 10 things that you need to do for every project, and if you miss one, it becomes catastrophic, or it becomes so disruptive later to cause untold potential exposure for the owner, that these are the kinds of things that checklists can really help with.
And the reasons, one of the reasons to list risk management separately, though, is because the important thing about managing risk is documenting that you've done what you told the client you were going to do. So if you sell the client on and put in your proposal or in your brochure that you have a QA QC system, we need to be able to document that any given project has gone through that system. This was a bit of a hot point with, we had 2 or 3 of our correspondents ask about, well, what is the danger of having one of these checklists in your file? Is that going to be a smoking gun that can work against you? And David and I don't really feel that way. I was a risk manager for a major, very large architectural firm for about 10 years. And my belief is that unless you just totally ignore the checklist, having a checklist that even shows that at some point it was looked at and they found some mistakes, they found some errors, somebody found some omissions, that shows that you were doing your due diligence. It shows that you were acting at a certain standard of care, and it is a demonstration that you have done a thorough checking, whereas a lot of firms, if they don't use checklists and just somebody sits and marks up red lines that may get trashed, can you prove after the fact that you in fact went through the QA QC system? So,
well, and one of the points here is that the checklists are not guaranteeing that the work is done necessarily correctly or that the solution is perfect. What it's really doing is trying to get to the process, that you followed a procedure to get to an end. And you mentioned that under quality management here, Louis, where you're looking for the consistency, so that no matter who on the design team or the construction team or anywhere else, no matter who's doing the work, you have the checklist, you follow the checklist. It will not take you necessarily to identical results if you have 2 people doing or attempting to do the same thing, but it will take you to a reasonably consistent result.
And that's what, yes, exactly. So, So, but we need one of the recurring questions is how do we deal with these elaborate, super long, very detailed checklists that nobody wants to use, and we can't blame them. And part of the issue is that we need to separate out different purposes and different types of checklists for those different purposes. And we're going to give some examples of each of these, but planning, whether you're planning the entire project, planning the production of the drawings, planning your specifications, we need to think about all the things that need to be decided on. A quality assurance checklist is going to be different from a quality control checklist, whereas quality assurance are those positive things that we try to do to make sure that the outcome is good and consistent. Quality control is where we try to catch the goofs before they go out the door. Handshakes between levels. Again, we'll talk about this a little more later, but if we separate checklists into different levels, then, for example, if a draftsman, a detailer has a checklist and completes that before he or she sends that drawing up to the project architect or the project interior designer or project engineer for checking, then that engineer, that project professional, doesn't have to check all those little details. Is the north arrow on the plans? Is the scale stated? That kind of stuff. Or can just very quickly glance at the list and say, oh yeah, you've done that. And then finally the record of completion. And again, in some cases, it behooves us to have something in the permanent file that says that we have gone through the process and can pull that out if ever questioned about it.
Yeah, and the planning, you mentioned planning, and really quality assurance is also the plan. So you roll those two together, you're planning how to get to the end and to produce the results that you really are looking for. And then the quality control simply becomes the check. Okay, we said we were going to do something. Did we actually do it and accomplish it correctly?
The verification. But the planning can be, well, we'll get into that a little bit further. There is a difference, I think, in terms of kind of planning the overall thing, whereas the quality assurance tend to be repetitive things that would be pretty much the same from one project to another. But planning is going to be unique for each project.
So we had a question here from Hassan Nagendra, and pardon me if I've not pronounced your name correctly. Are there separate checklists for designer versus checklist production team versus construction administration?
Absolutely, and that's the basic point that we're going to, or one of the basic things that we want to try to communicate today, is that you do need different types. There are different purposes for checklists, and then there are different types depending upon some of those purposes, and that every firm, we're going to give you some resources towards the end of the program, some places that you can go to for some example checklists that might get you started. But one of the things that Dave and I feel very strongly about is that individual firms need to have their own checklist depending upon what's their practice like. A set of checklists for a 3-person firm is going to be different from a 900-person firm. It's if you do your primary market area are schools, your checklists are going to be different from a firm whose primary market area is hospitals.
And then for some of those larger firms, you may have multiple checklists because you have different studios dealing with different building types or different types of owners or projects in different areas of the country and or around the world for that matter, because they could all change what you're doing for the checklist. But part of the rationale in even looking at the checklists, I think, is that we want to get it to something that's simplified enough to ensure their use and to make sure that they're meaningful.
And that's the hard part. And we had some questions about that, and we will talk about that a little bit later. Ron Lincoln asked, do you know if old Ready checklists still exist? I have an original copy for the last 25 years. Yes, Ready Check is alive and well. As a matter of fact,
it's a thriving business.
Thriving business. And some of you may want to contact them if they do peer reviews for drawings and specifications. And I actually, in 1995, took a 4-day course at the University of Wisconsin on detecting deficiencies in working drawings and specifications, and Bill Nigro, who developed the ReadyCheck system, taught one whole day of that class, and we got a copy of his book, which I have since subsequently updated, and yes, you can get onto their website, you can buy the most recent version. That's, of course, specifically for QC, and his reason for inventing it, he was working for the Navy at the time, and they were having lots of trouble with excessive change orders and nasty surprises, and so he invented this system to minimize the change orders based primarily on interdiscipline coordination issues.
Right. So this was all reactionary in a way to try to help the government produce better projects, less costly projects, and avoid some of those problems. Hey, we had an interesting comment here from Steve Groth, who's saying, it hadn't occurred to me before, but the way you are describing using checklists is really the design and documentation version of construction verification checklists for commissioning.
I hadn't thought about that, Steve. Excellent point.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of it that way either.
Well, let's talk about different types of checklists. And again, we're used to the idea of like the one here in the graphic that has one little set of boxes, and you check it off as done, or you X it out as it's wasn't done correctly, or you have a question mark as whether it's applicable or not. But there are different types. The first one we have listed is read-do, and that's the method that they use, the pilots use, especially if you have a co-pilot. But even if you're a single pilot driving a small single-engine private plane, you have a checklist, you read it down, and you say, yep, I've done that. Yep, I've done that. The flaps are set. The brakes are set, and go down. It's also used in medicine and operating rooms. We'll talk later about the checklist manifesto that was actually written by a surgeon. And often the reader of such checklists, if there's a team, is not necessarily the head. So for in an operating room, it may be one of the nurses rather than the lead doctor, because he's got a lot of other things on his mind. But the nurse reads down the list to make sure that everything's been done. And they don't actually write, check things off as such, as so much as they verbally acknowledge that it was in fact finished.
Right.
So we have the check boxes and completed or blank.
I like the graphic that you found here, Louis, to show that it's not necessarily check that it's done. It could be the question mark saying, possibly I need more information about this to even be able to complete the task.
Yes, and
And
we'll
that
see
can be a valuable. That really can be a valuable answer.
because that shows where you have to focus some of your time and energy, and we'll have some specific examples about that, especially in the specifications work plan example of checklists. Which brings me to the next method, master lists for deletion. Now, a lot of folks, when planning a spec, should take out the master spec table of contents or your spec master table of contents, and you go through and you just mark out the ones that you don't need. And so that's what we're talking about. That's sort of a master list for deletion. May also apply to drawings in terms of what kinds of drawings are you going to need for a specific project. And finally, people don't think of it, but a flow chart is, in effect, a kind of a checklist. It's basically a redo checklist because, again, you don't necessarily mark it off and to leave a record, but it is a guide to doing things. And one of the differences between the other types of checklists is that a flow chart has a specific sequence involved and may have alternative routes. And again, we'll look at an example of that a little later in the program.
And the flow charts too may indicate some sort of a time limitation within the process as well, which is when you're trying to identify the work and how it must be done, can sometimes be a big help too in ensuring that it's done at the proper time.
All right. Let's see. I think we have a couple comments to get caught up on there, David.
Okay. Again, from Hassan Nagendra, I've discussed the ready check with Bill, and he was very careful to tell me, Bill Nigro, to tell me that ready check was to look for conflicts between discipline versus attempting to determine errors in design or details that may not prevent water from leaking into the building.
Yes, that's true. And the QC drawing review checklist that I have developed over many years, I started with the ready check, but I've got things in there about flashing and sealants and one thing and another that are within the architectural discipline in particular, that I'm looking for that might be missing, whereas ready check focuses almost exclusively on the interdiscipline coordination. Is the hole in the floor for the ducts big enough and in the right place?
Right. So we have another comment from Bill Dubois. It says, I helped create a checklist of sorts at a large firm for interior designers to make sure design decisions, material selections, criteria is thoroughly considered. We choose to call it a quality assurance worksheet, since not every point needed to be considered for every project. The document was seen to help designers become better decision makers.
Boy, anything that will help designers become better decision makers. I mean, that's what we're all about, is making good decisions and documenting those and communicating those decisions. We're in the decision business.
There's one more aspect, Lewis. Make the decision and stick to it.
Stay with it, yes. Yes. Yes, we all know that the old joke about that CD phase, that the CD stands for continuing to design, but it ought not to.
Ought not is right.
Okay, and on the flow charts here, this little quote from Edward Deming, the famous American efficiency expert. That we'll talk more about that when we get to it. Okay, so we need some checklists, and we need to start writing them. So what are the guiding principles? Well, it's got to be short enough that people will actually use it. One of the reasons that people are allergic to checklists, and I have run into some people, David, that are just adamantly. They'd rather volunteer for an unnecessary root canal than to use a checklist. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that many of them are so detailed and they're so lengthy that it's an onerous task, and it doesn't support the work. The whole point of a checklist is it's supposed to help you with your work, not make it harder,
or not become work in and of itself. Because if they're so daunting, you're right. Nobody will want to even begin the checklist because they're probably fearful that they'll never make it through it. And if, heaven forbid, that one of the items should not be checked off, did they fail to do their job?
Yes, and then there's that smoking gun sitting in the file that your PM may pull out, or your supervisor may pull out and say,
yes,
we need to talk about that raise that you want. So we have this balance. How do we make it short enough that people will actually use it, but detailed enough to cover what's important to achieve consistent quality?
Right. And I think one of the things that can help guide this really is look at the tasks and break them down. You can probably generate checklists that are under 10 items, but it's going to be for a specific task. It's not going to be for an entire design project. And
yes.
if you can use the checklist to help you get through that one task and complete it well, then you move on to the next. So you pull out the checklist, short, 1 page, 10 items, hopefully a postcard size, and mark it up, get it done, put it away, put it aside, and move on to the next and complete the next thing the exact same way.
Yeah. Now, a quality control checklist for reviewing drawings is going to be lengthy. There's just no way around it. But as David said, for most of the things that we do, we can break them into tasks, or I like to use the word procedures, that are discrete and can be documented in 10 or fewer steps. So the first concept of solving this problem of balance between the two is following the 80-20 Pareto rule, which means...
And this is ever so true, regardless. And one of the things that, if we can keep this in mind in writing the checklist, we're not there trying to capture every last little detail. I'm looking for those things, and I said it earlier, that would be catastrophic. That if this is not done, something terrible is going to happen, or you're not ever going to be able to complete the project and get it right. So make sure that you've done this, make sure that you do it at the right time, and that way everything can proceed much more smoothly, much more easily, much more efficiently. If we get those 80% by those 20% causes, the rest will fall into place. We don't have to capture all of those.
And the minority that are not listed are usually low ticket items. They're not very costly. But another thing that you may want to think about when you're developing a checklist is there's a possibility that your staff, the culture in your office, whatever, there are things that people just miss. And so that's one of the things you want to put on the list. For example, at my previous firm, I did a lot of the quality assurance, quality control reviews for multiple offices, and about every fourth project, somebody would forget, the project team would forget the fire extinguishers. Well, an individual fire extinguisher is not an expensive item, but I had a project that was an industrial complex, multiple buildings, over 1 million square feet, and without a single fire extinguisher shown, and I did some quick calculations, and that was going to be $600,000, $700,000 change order if it had gone through, or a very embarrassing note from the plans examiner at the municipality where it was going to be built.
Well, and one of the things that I see as an independent specifier, because of when we sometimes come into the project, there are two things that I want to know absolutely first. What is the building construction type by code? What is the occupancy? Because those two decisions affect so many things in the specifications. If those are not right, the specifications cannot be right. And there are projects that we are asked to start, and that code review is not done. And the architects cannot tell us definitively what the construction type is, nor what the use is.
Those are pretty high level. Those are pretty strategic, and it's inexcusable that. So a checklist should prod people into saying, I've got to get answers to these things before I can go any further. There's no point in even beginning to sketch around with a bubble diagram. Am I dating myself with that phrase? That until I understand how the building's going to be used. All right. Second concept, and this is what David was talking about a few minutes ago, is break lengthy checklists down into manageable sizes. So, for example, we're going to give you an example later of a sheet checklist. There's a wonderful book. Again, it'll be on one of the last slides in our presentation about drawings, and in the back of the book there are checklists for each type of sheet. So details, floor plans, reflected ceiling plans, whatever, to make sure that everything is caught. And the things that a detailer who's actually drawing that sheet should look at, like is the north arrow in there? Are the building expansion joints prominently shown and noted? Those kinds of things that are really fairly basic. That's not the stuff that the project manager should be looking at. So that now, concept of yes.
You know, I have to ask. There's a glaring missing part of the design team here.
Oh no.
There is.
What is that?
Where did you forgot the specifier?
That's true.
Sheldon will not be happy. You forgot the specifier.
Considering that our R1, I should know better.
So yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Depending upon the role in the project, the kinds of things that you're going to be looking for, the kinds of things you'll be concerned about, the checklist will be different. And to talk about the north arrow being on a sheet, the checklist should probably be something north arrow, period. We don't need to describe that the north arrow should be checked to be sure that it's pointing in the right direction. The fact that you're checking for the north arrow should certainly presume that you would put it on or know that it's pointing in the right direction. Or at least cause you to think about it when you're looking to make sure the north arrow is there.
So Jeffrey Pelos has a comment. He says, doing a design criteria document, PPD, in uniformat provides a good base for project-specific checklists. That's absolutely true, Jeffrey. And David and I are behind you 100% on that. Unfortunately, they're rarely done. Specifically, our problem is mostly trying to get lists to avoid omissions in the specification of essential items noted in the drawings. Firms we work with seem to be baffled by descriptions of how they want systems to perform and think only about how they want them to look. This turns into a last-minute fire drill. Oh,
Well, sounds like we're preaching to the choir.
I think so.
Okay.
Years ago, when CSI first invented the concept of the preliminary project description, came out in the 1989 Manual of Practice, as I recall. And I thought that was a great idea. I started doing it, and I made as Jeffrey suggests, not the full PPD, but a checklist. And I would give that to the lead designer in our firm, and I just say, just note down stream of consciousness. What do you see when you close your eyes about these different things? And essentially every time he went through that process, he'd come back and say, I'm so glad that we went through this, because it required me to think about some things I had not thought to think of and make decisions about. Dave Stevens asked about the different tasks for the different 4 bulleted roles. Okay, the principal in charge is going to want to make sure that there's a signed contract in the drawer, that the project manager is meeting the schedule, that the billings are up to date, and kind of business end sort of things. The project manager is going to want to make sure that interdiscipline coordination is proceeding in an appropriate manner, that again the schedules are being met. The project professional, whether it's the architect, the engineer, interior designer, is going to want to make sure that their discipline stuff is technically correct and is complete and is thorough. Project coordinator is, not all firms have that kind of role, but in my previous firm, that was the person who took care of things like getting the sheets printed correctly and in the right sequence, and assembling the drawings together, and assembling the specifications, and getting them prepared. So it's kind of a paperwork sort of checklist. And then finally the detailer, and we talked about that, and we'll show some examples. Okay, well, let's look at some examples. Here's a bad example. This is a sheet.
Bad because you can't read it, number one,
well,
but okay.
Yeah. And I apologize.
You're going to explain why it's really bad. 32 pages, that's a good start.
And notice also that you have a column for who's going to do it. So we'd have theoretically different people responsible for each one of these lines. Somebody's got to fill out the date that it's due in this column, and then the person who's responsible for it has to come back in and fill out the check. So we're talking about multiple people filling this thing out. And
this is a full-time person just to manage this checklist.
Exactly. And here's a close-up of it. And again, I apologize that it's not overly readable. And it just goes on for page after page after page. And no wonder it gives people the heebie-jeebies just to look at it.
And this is one that would ask you to check that the north arrow was actually pointing in the right direction.
It would probably also ask to make sure that there's both a planned north and a true north arrow on the site plan.
Yes, I'm sure.
All right, so here's some good examples. Well, let's see. Who wrote this, David?
Well, this was one that I put together only because we had some difficulty actually collecting the right information to write our proposals to our clients. And so what I ended up trying to boil this down to 2 pages. What are the absolute essential things that we must have to know how to write our proposal? So things like, what's the project name? And what is it? Is that important? Well, it could help us to understand enough to know what or how we're going to have to price our fees to be able to satisfy each individual client. And it's really it's a matter of sitting down, and this form takes probably less than 10 minutes to complete. And what I tend to do is when we get a request for proposal, I will fill this form out and send it to our client to say, this is what we understand. So if it's not correct, mark it up, send it back, and that's what we will use to write the proposal. So it really comes down to a communication tool, but it's also a checklist for us to know that we've asked all the questions that we needed to ask.
And what's the response from our clients, David?
Well, I actually happened to meet with one of them last week. We had the client was concerned about the specification process and how we were actually able to make sure that we were getting everything done that they thought needed to be done. And without asking, this particular client is one that we had used this form with, and the principal of the firm was praising the form and essentially telling the staff that was in the meeting with us that this form must be completed by every one of their project managers before the proposal is even done. So he's already insisting on it just by having gone through the process once with us. So he sees value, and I think that that's really the important part. There's a perception of value to make sure that things are not missed.
Now here's an example of some checklists that David has prepared for our firm, Conspectus. That again, there are only 10 items on them because they're very specific tasks. Getting the project kickoff scheduled, getting once all the sections have been edited and are in final form, how do we get it out the door?
Right. So you asked earlier, we had the question earlier about what roles. So the project kickoff list, and looking at this, signed proposal. So this might go to a principal or a project manager on a firm. So the project kickoff is like a very high level, and again, it's one of these things that number 7 on the list is kickoff meeting scheduled. Without a kickoff meeting for us to actually be able to sit down with the architects or our client, whoever they are, and review what's going to be required, it's a problem to make sure that anything happens correctly after that we don't have that initial communication. The issue checklist is something more. This is a production task. So this can be done by our staff specifiers, can be done by our administrative assistant, and it's used to help communicate between them as we assemble the final project manual. That everything that absolutely has to be done to be able to publish the manual has been completed.
Timothy Hockett provides a very telling comment. He says, the beauty of the checklist practice in my firm has been reduction in rework. And I'm all about being profitable as well as being efficient. This is an example of a planning sort of a checklist. Now, it doesn't have check boxes. So in one sense, it's kind of a redo, but we need to define what constitutes the amount of information, what decisions need to be made at the SD level, DD level, and CD. The definitions of those 3 phases in the Architect's Handbook of Professional Practice are fairly wide open because they have to cover everything from a single practitioner who does his houses and corner convenience stores to a multi-office, multi-discipline firm that does complicated projects like hospitals and airports. So this is one of those things where you may want to spend some time thinking about your practice, your types of projects, and define for yourself what are your goals in terms of decisions, the types of information that should be decided upon. Because if there's a decision that you can make in schematic design that you put off to design development, chances are, if you could make that decision in an hour or two with some research and thinking, in design development there's a multiplier of at least 5 and possibly 10. And if that same decision is put off to construction documents, that's really big, because there's there's the ripple effect that if you have to change, and in schematic design you can start drawing the details right in design development, but if your decision is off base, and by the time you get to CDs and you have dozens of window details and they all have the same error in them, it's going to cost you a lot of money, a lot of rework.
Well, it's disruptive is the problem.
It's very frustrating to your team also. So it behooves us to create these definitions. And this is just one page. You can see it's page 6 out of 8 of different categories of information that need to be. And this is not hard and fast, because then on the next project you can look at it and say, well, you know, that design development goal or that the soffits I need to think about in the schematic design phase, or I can put off to CDs. But at least it gets you thinking about it, raising the consciousness level.
Yep.
This is a specifications work plan, and for my at my previous firm, well, actually I invented this back sometime in the 80s, and the sections that are listed in boldface type are ones that we have spec masters for, whether they're from Master Spec or ones that I had written. And the ones that are in normal font are things that might be needed someday, but I don't have a spec master for them. And so those are really critical to identify, because they're going to take more time. You have to research them, you have to write from scratch, or you have to see if you can find an example spec somewhere on the internet, or a big one from one of your spec writing CSI buddies. And so
an advantage here to including a more massive list, and it looks like this is one that's almost coming right out of master format, that it offers you the checklist as opposed to of the larger universe of potential spec titles, as opposed to looking only at, say, a master spec table of contents, which is just simply limited to that one source.
Yes, because there's some fairly basic sections that are interestingly absent from master spec, bless their hearts. I mean, they do a wonderful job, and I've been using the master spec since October 1982, but there are some fairly basic sections that they just don't have. This is an example of a master list for deletion. So you go through, you delete what you don't need, or you can put tone it out as a gray, just in case the designers decide to add it back in at a later period. But that's how that works. So we're gotta pick up the pace here. We got several to show. But yes, so don't rely on the table of contents, because what you may need may not be there. This is an example that you can get on the internet, and we're going to give you the address later on. And by the way, at some point you will be able to download, I know some of this is hard to read, but you will be able to download a PDF and have the information. But there's Charles Nelson, who wrote Managing Quality in Architecture, who's an Australian architect, I wrote this checklist. You probably can't read it, but underneath it says check it project quality report in parentheses Australian English. So you got all you cobbers out there can understand this.
So so you're going to offer translation services, correct?
Once a jolly swag man camped down by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. I know all the words.
Oh dear. Okay.
Sorry. All right, but this is just an example of this is a fairly high level one that a project manager might use for schematic designs, and it does have a checkbox, but it's just a source that's out there that you could get onto. And then there's the book by Wiggins that I'm going to show you later that has these wonderful examples of checklists for different sheet types. I picked floor plans here, but he has them for elevator details, stair details, wall sections. It's a really, really great book because he gives some example drawings for a simple, like, 3-story office building. And it shows the drawings at different levels. He shows them at conceptual, what information should be at SD, what information should be at DD, what information is at CD. And friends and neighbors, you should get a copy of that book and have it in your office for your younger staff because it's really very useful. But this kind of thing could be printed, could be in Revit, could be out on the side of the sheet so that the detailer could just go through and check all these things off, and when the detailer turns that sheet in to the project professional for redlining, the project professional, the architect, the interior designer, engineer can look down and say, oh yeah, he's got all that stuff, and not have to worry about it. And because the question is, who should be checking that level of stuff? Is that something, what level of pay grade do we want doing that?
Right, and you mentioned Revit. This is something that actually could be an attribute to a particular sheet type. So it could be part of the data set right in Revit, and from that standpoint, then you could actually use Revit and the capacity to manage the data to know whether or not the items were indeed completed.
Right. Stacy and Mary and John have all asked about the author and the book title, and we're going to get to that in a little bit.
It better be a short bit.
Yeah, we're running out of time.
We're getting close to the hour here, Louis.
Yeah, Jeffrey Pelis says that there's 134 pages of checklists in the BIM project execution guide from Penn State University for free on the internet. Yes, I picked up on that. So this is the QC drawing review checklist that I use, and I have a color coding for stuff that I think should be in the DD phase, and blue is a CD phase. And you notice I have 3 columns for it's okay, it's not okay, or it's not applicable. And then I can make some remarks, some rude remarks off to the side about, did you really mean to do that, sport? This is a procedure checklist for drawing revisions, and this is a redo kind of concept, but we have a point where there's a question, does the revision affect contract sum or time? And if it does, then there's an alternate route through a sequence of events that has to happen. So that's just a simple example, but again, you can see there are only 10 complete steps and the whole thing, because it's narrowed down to one procedure, issuing a revised drawing. Okay, as promised, here are the resources. Checklist Manifesto, David and I have both read that. I even own a copy.
It's a short book. It's a great read. If of all of the ones here, if you do nothing else, get that one.
It even has a checklist for checklists. It does have, although he's a neurosurgeon, and a lot of it has to do with medical checklists and how they came about. He does talk also about where they came from in terms of airplanes to start with, and then he has a whole chapter on buildings.
I especially like his example for the checklist for a pilot when the engine fails.
Yes.
So what is the number one item? Any guess? The number one item on the checklist is fly the plane. Then do everything else to try to start the engine.
That's right. Keep it going. Manual of Practice of Construction Documentation by Glenn Wiggins. You can Google that, that's on. It's available through Amazon, and that's the one that has the sheet type checklist. But it also has those wonderful examples of the different levels of information for the different phases that our younger folks, bless their hearts, sometimes think more about how to draw than what to draw. And this is a really, really good book, because whether using BIM or using ink on parchment, the end result should be pretty much the same in terms of communicating on pieces of 2D paper to a contractor. Managing Quality in Architecture, Charles Nelson, and the Check-It system. The book is really good, but it's a total quality management. It goes far beyond just production. It goes into managing the quality of running your business, of choosing and avoiding certain clients and receivables and all kinds of things. And it goes into how to achieve ISO 9000 certification if you're interested in that. And then, of course, we talked about ReadyCheck interdisciplinary coordination. And again, you can Google ReadyCheck and find his place right off. So that's we appreciate that this is just a bare bones introduction. And when I first started laying this thing out, I actually left out a lot of stuff that I had in my original outline. After my first pass, when I was talking with David about planning this thing, I said, I've got enough information here for a 200-page book. And he says, well, start writing.
Well, and you and I are, I think, on the same page on this. We both find checklists valuable. We try to use them, but we try to limit what we're doing with them to manage things that we know must be managed and managed correctly, instead of trying to apply them to absolutely everything.
Right, make them practical. Again, early next week, Matt will have a PDF of this presentation available for downloading, so you can look at some of the stuff at your leisure, and you don't have to worry about reading the fine print on this website for the Check-It system if you want to follow up on that. We know that your time is valuable, and we respect that, and we are very we really appreciate your attendance and your interest in what we're trying to accomplish, and we just hope that we're talking about things that have some interest. And I think today we
hit a nerve with this one, actually. We got a lot of positive response, and we really do appreciate hearing from you that it is a topic that is of interest.
Yeah, Jeffrey Pilas actually asked for more, but I'm not sure everybody would feel that way.
Possibly in the future we can dive into it deeper.
So, this is your show, folks. Keep those cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors. If you have ideas, things that you'd like us to talk about, we don't have the March program completely lined up. We think we're going to have the second part of door hardware, but stay tuned. We'll find out.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us today, and just remember, next month's meeting, March 2, 3 o'clock Eastern, so we're looking forward to having you all. Watch for the announcement that Matt will be sending out later this month.